Less than 9 months later, on February 20th, 1962, tens of millions of people around the world anxiously watched on television as Mercury astronaut John Glenn rose into the sky atop an Atlas rocket and circled the Earth 3 times. During his 4-hour, 52-minute flight, Glenn became the first American ever to see both a sunrise and a sunset from space as he looked down on our world from over 200 miles above the Earth.
Well, there's a lot we didn't know, and that was the purpose of those early flights, was to find out. You know, Al Shepard did the first flight, Gus Grissom, and they were concerned enough about those. We did those suborbital flights. Those were up and down flights, 15, 18 minutes long. Then my flight was the first orbital flight where we'd have extended periods of weightlessness so that we'd get more of a handle on these things if there were major problems.
After his return to Earth, not only was John Glenn a national hero, more important, Project Mercury's primary purpose, that of sending a man into orbit around the Earth, had been achieved. After 3 more successful Mercury missions, it was time to move on to Project Gemini and another step closer to the moon.
We started with Mercury, then President Kennedy said, let's go to the moon. And someone said, well, we'll just finish Mercury and get ready and go to the moon. Sorry about that. There was no way to make that work. We'd never done a rendezvous. We didn't have long-duration missions. We needed precise splashdown, and we needed to get the whole system up and operating.
I think the progression from Mercury on was set very early. Gemini was stuck in the middle as sort of a development program. There was just a number of things we didn't understand well enough yet to really go to the moon without taking that interim step. So we view Gemini as a stepping stone to Apollo, but not a program by itself.
Project Gemini may have been considered only a stepping stone to Apollo by some, but each of its 10 journeys into space continued to excite the minds and imaginations of the American public. During the flight of Gemini 4, millions watched as astronaut Ed White became the first American to walk in space. Overlooking the distant Earth, White swam through space for 22 minutes while tethered to his Gemini spacecraft.
Okay, I'm out. Okay, I'm coming over. I feel like $1 million.
6 months later, in December 1965, the Gemini 7 crew of Frank Borman and James Lovell not only set a record for the longest stay in space, 14 days, they also achieved Gemini's primary purpose by making the first ever orbital rendezvous and docking with their sister spacecraft Gemini 6, piloted by Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford.
On my particular Gemini mission with Tom Stafford, we did a rendezvous with Gemini 7. 7 was up there as our target, and that they were up there proving the vehicle could last 2 weeks. Now, to go to the moon and back, you need to have about a 2-week mission, about 11 days. And that includes 3 days to get there and about 3 or 4 days to mill around on the moon and 3 days to get home. So we had to have spacecraft and humans that could endure that long. We didn't even know that in those days. Gordon Cooper had flown Mercury for about 24 hours. That was it.
There was a lot riding on that mission because the Apollo was being designed with the giant Saturn V with a lunar module, command module, to do the rendezvous around the moon. And had we proved that the rendezvous was very difficult or nearly impossible, that could have had a major impact on the program.
Gemini was considered a roaring success. Now it was on to Apollo and the final steps to the moon. As President Kennedy had promised, the Apollo project was destined to put the United States on the lunar surface before the end of the 1960s. But the question that continued to haunt America was, who would get there first, the Americans or the Russians?
They were ahead of us, no question about it. They were ahead of us time after time after time. And for the first orbital flight, the first spacewalk, the first woman in space, they even landed on the moon before we did with unmanned spacecraft.
For a number of years in this space race, we were eating space dust and doing our best to catch up. And somehow in the mid-60s, they faltered. And the technology apparently didn't collapse so much as their engineering management. And this kind of very bitter infighting, which makes our own inter-service rivalry look like a mild disagreement, crippled their space technology and led to their ultimate loss in the moon race.
Even before the first Apollo spacecraft was launched, Disaster struck the American space program. On January 27, 1967, just as the Apollo program was nearing readiness for its first flight, a fire inside the command module took the lives of 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee.
I was sitting at this console right here when we had 3 men die in a spacecraft. And I listened to it. So we've had a lot of pain and a lot of exhilaration in this room. That's right. But that's what anything worthwhile is made up of, isn't it? You got to have a lot of pain to go along with a lot of exhilaration.
And there was exhilaration during the Apollo years. It started on Christmas Eve, 1968, when Apollo 8 crew members Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders read a passage from the book of Genesis while becoming the first Americans to orbit the moon.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
Apollo 8 was a very unique flight. Borman and Anders and myself were the first 3 people to actually get to the moon, to see the far side of the moon. We looked out the windows, but all we could see is a dark velvet sky. And then we rotated the spacecraft around about 180 degrees. And there, just below us, 60 miles, was the ancient old craters on the far side of the moon slowly slipping by. It was really the most remarkable sight that I have seen, perhaps the most awe-inspiring period of my space career.
After the resounding successes of Apollo 7, 8, and 9, the American space program was ready for its final dress rehearsal for the landing of the first men on the moon. Apollo 10 crew members Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan took their lunar module, nicknamed Snoopy, to within 9 miles of the moon's surface.
Cernan and I went down to 8 and 9 miles above the moon while John Young stayed up at 60 miles in command module. We radar mapped, we photo mapped, we picked out that landing site where Neil would land 2 months later, and we saw these boulders. I never forget the boulders. God, they were awesome. And there were boulders bigger in diameter than the World Trade Center is tall.
With the critical success of Apollo 10, the final step toward the moon was ready to be taken. Apollo 11 was waiting to lift off into the heavens in search of mankind's ultimate dream, and science fiction was about to become science fact.
And when that one came back, then we knew that barring some unforeseen event, we'd get to carry out the world's greatest adventure as far as technology and exploration goes.
The Voyagers pass over the Sea of Fertility. It is Sunday, July 20th. 100 hours, 39 minutes, 50 seconds into the mission.
Then we had to separate the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, from the spaceship itself, from Apollo 11. And that was, of course, the most critical, well, the second most critical moment of all.
Roger, Eagle, I'm dot. Roger, how does it look? The Eagle has wings. Roger. Roger, you're a go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent.
Altitude now 21,000 feet, still looking very good. Velocity down now to 1,200 feet per second.
You're looking great to us, Eagle.
We've now got 30 minutes from now to the time that we're going to actually put a man on the moon. And then pretty soon the guidance officer comes in. And he says, "Hey, flight, I got a problem." And one of the controllers in the loop, I've never found out who it is, comes up and says, "You know, this is almost like a simulation." Everybody just for a second relaxes, we smile, at which time we know we got it made. Because we always work best when we're having problems. We thrive in problems, we devour problems, we eat problems, we gobble them up. Problems are what we're here for. We're the insurance.
At 1,000 feet, Armstrong takes over manual control of the LEM. He is now intently searching for the planned lunar landing site.
We normally land with about 2 minutes of fuel. And we see this indicator. It's like a warning light that comes on. that says 2 minutes hover time fuel remaining. We would have normally landed by this time, but we know we're up and away. We get another call from my controller, 60 seconds, and very terse comment in the uplink from Charlie Duke to the crew. He just says 60 seconds. That's 60 seconds of fuel remaining. 60 seconds the crew has to find a spot to land or we're going to have to abort.